Help us understand sort of what we can read into this string of arrests here, John. What does it say about the way security services are investigating what happened in Manchester?
Well, I think what's happening today is that we've seen clear signs that the investigation is taking on an international element. So there has been obviously lots of police activities in Manchester today, but also in Tripoli in Libya, where, of course, the family of the bomber came from. We've had a series of arrests as well. Very dramatic scenes in Tripoli, where the father of the suspected bomber was arrested just minutes after Bloomberg actually interviewed him, and also his brother. Brother of the bomber, who admits to being in the UK at the time when this attack was planned. He's back in Tripoli, and he was also arrested. So, we're seeing here clear signs of the investigation going international as British authorities dig deeper into what looks increasingly like a network of people supporting this terrorist attack.
As Mark Crumpton just mentioned a moment ago, the terrorism risk level has been raised. What does that mean in practical terms? What goes into a decision to do that?
Well, it is very dramatic. I mean, we are seeing soldiers now patrolling the streets of London, which is something that most people have never really seen. I think, visitors to Brussels and Paris and of recent times would this would be a common sight in those cities, but not in London. So that obviously it's a very vivid way of bringing home to people just how heightened the terror alert here is. But clearly, when we saw the news last night that the terror level had been rated, it was a clear signal that the British authorities saw this as being about more than a lone wolf, and that there was a threat, as the Prime Minister herself said, an imminent threat of more attacks. So, there are tensions are running high in the government. There's clear concern about this, and that's what lay behind that decision.
John, you mentioned the growing international aspect of this investigation. It brings up the issue of intelligence sharing as the web of this gets wider. How does that stand to change as the Brexit process unfolds, and indeed as we get to a complete Brexit? What's that going to mean for the way that the UK gets and gives intelligence information to allies?
Well, certainly this does give an added sort of emotional charge to the parts of the Brexit negotiations. If Britain doesn't negotiate a new intelligence sort of relationship with the EU, then it could actually fall out of all of the frameworks that have been set up over the last few decades in Europe when it comes to intelligence sharing. But there's another very interesting development that happened today, where the British Home Secretary Amber Rudd made the very unusual step of publicly criticising US intelligence sources, I guess you call them. But it was interesting on Monday night what we saw reports in the US press about the nature of the terrorist attacks and the number of people killed. And what seems to have happened is that UK intelligence services gave that information to their US colleagues, and that was then promptly leaked to the US media. So there was clear anger on the side of Amber Rudd today as she talked about this. And of course, this comes on the back of the whole sort of furore about Trump giving the Russian foreign minister too much information that possibly had been supplied to the US from Israel.
John, last question here. Just give us a preview of what's to come at this NATO summit in Brussels. The US have been advocating for NATO as a whole to join this anti-ISIS, anti-Islamic State coalition. There are reports now that allies have agreed to do that. What else is on the agenda in Brussels today and tomorrow?
Well, there is that. I mean, the Manchester bombings will very much hang over this NATO meeting. I mean, obviously Russia will be the elephant in the room. So far as we can tell, Russia is not actually on the agenda of this NATO meeting. So that's going to be it'll be quite interesting to watch to see if that's actually discussed on the sidelines. But also, I think the tone of how President Trump approaches this NATO meeting. I mean, obviously he made a big deal out of calling NATO obsolete during the campaign trail, and there are still question marks about his relationship with certain leaders. They still don't really have the measure of President Trump, and I think the NATO summit and the G7 summit as well later on in the week will give the likes of Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel a much better opportunity to sort of look into the whites of his eyes and see if they can figure out what his priorities really are, because there are still a lot of question marks about what kind of foreign policy he really wants for the United States.